All right, shall we get started here? I want to finish up a couple of remarks on Nietzsche. First of all, almost all of this is done from memory because an odd thing, when I got retired, it I don't want to make it sound like I was fired. The budget wasn't there for they weren't getting that many philosophy students and the budget wasn't there, and so they didn't hire me because I was just a temporary hire every semester for 35 years or something like that. For every class, it was a way of the college saving money. They didn't have to give me all the benefits and and they couldn't hire two full-time people, so that I was the basically the fielder, but I didn't care because it was perfect for me because I didn't have to engage in any kind of college bureaucracy or anything. I showed up and taught my class and went home. Anyway, when I did that, I tossed all my notes out, and uh, I tend to do this. I tend to turn my back on that part of my life and move on. It's not out of pique or anything or anger. It's like, okay, turn that page. And so I've been doing this all from memory. So just having to recreate things and so forth and look up the passages. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. So I was reviewing Schopenhauer as educator, one of Nietzsche's first books, and I went, oh my God, I and this is true of Kierkegaard too. I really live. I can see my life as being described in those books, and uh, it's impossible for me to tell whether I know that at the time I read them, they resonated with me. But whether I could say, "Oh yeah, I read this book and therefore I did this and this and this," I can't say that. But on the other hand, it is a way to frame a wayward and unfocused life in a way that has a slight more bit of nobility to it. That's one benefit of it. We can I can fictionalize things and put them under the heading of grand philosophical concepts, uh, and I do. I don't know if I do. Anyway, so Schopenhauer as educator, mainly. I'm sorry Alan isn't here because one of the things that he says was even in his day, this is 150 years ago or more, education was meant to prepare one uh, for the workforce, to be a cog in the machine and to take direction and do what you were told and so forth. And Schopenhauer says that's not what education is. Education is something you must tackle and live through. Remember, Hegel said you can't stand aloof from philosophical questions. We're going to run into that with Kierkegaard again, but also with Nietzsche. And one of the issues I didn't, this is separate from what I just said, which is just a bunch of personal nonsense. But one of the issues with Nietzsche we didn't discuss greatly was the will to power, which he's very famous for, and the Übermensch. And I think both these concepts should be interpreted as personal concepts, he's not, well, he is really a little hard to trap. And so if I say something, there'll be a passage you can find that contradicts what I'm saying. Nevertheless, let's say I view these concepts as Nietzsche talking to himself or talking to the person that wants to become actualized and not trying to emphasize great men as being people who are suitable dictators. I don't think that's what he was about. He was interested in these concepts as they applied to the spiritual growth of any individual. And so the will to power was kind of based on what he thought was based on observations of what people were. And it's similar to the concept of qi in Chinese thought, personal power. And I think I have a quote here. I've had to go re find all these. Anyway, the world is the will to power, nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power, nothing besides. In other words, that it's the desire to become fully real. And he would say we share that with uh, all living things, the desire to be, if you're say a herd animal and you're the male, you want to be the alpha male, right? You want to be as big as you can be. In herd animals, that applies to dominance over other males, but it doesn't necessarily do that in as far as Nietzsche's concerned with regard to human males. What they want to do is dominate their weakness, dominate themselves, so that they're not uh, caving in to the temptation to be. And remember, the his biggest sins were laziness and weakness, uh, lack of courage, laziness and lack of courage. So these are to be applied to yourself. And so when I'm going to be criticizing Christianity from Nietzsche's point of view, and then later today we're going to get to Kierkegaard's point of view. They both criticize Christianity, and in some ways their criticisms are similar, but they're really not the same. Nietzsche thought that Christianity was a religion of resentment. And the ideas of judgment day and heaven are ways that weak people get back at strong people. Because you'll see on judgment day, you're going to get your comeuppance. That's the kind of thing. And so it's a substitute for your own personal achievement. You say, well, referring to the Beatitudes, which is a great, the meek will inherit the earth. And Nietzsche said, no, they won't. Well, what kind of talk is that? That's the talk of a delusional person. And so he viewed some of the fundamental teachings of Christianity as delusional substitutions for actually tackling your own self. And you say, well, someday and I'll go to heaven and you won't. And that's a religion of resentment. That's what he thought it was, a religion for the weak. And he also thought, what a great marketing opportunity, because most of us are weak and most of us are cowardly. So if all of a sudden somebody tells us, no, no, you're the chosen ones, the meek, you guys will inherit the earth, not those big guys who are rich. And remember, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. So don't worry yourself, says Christianity, about dominating other men because they're going to be the failures and everything will be upside down once Judgment Day has come. This is Nietzsche's portrayal of Christianity. I'm not saying it's mine, I'm just saying that's what he thought about it. And also referring back to Plato, remember, Plato thought that the intellect and the knowledge of the eternal verities or eternal forms should and could dominate the animal nature or the appetitive nature. And that was the only real way to live. Whereas Nietzsche thought that's another delusion, that you can actually dominate your animal character with your intellect. Your animal character is what created your intellect. And so it's more primary than the intellectual character. Remember, the intellect is the claws of the human being. It's the weapon of the human being. It's not something that is independent of the animal itself. Okay, so I just wanted to spend another couple of minutes on Nietzsche before we move on to criticize or to Kierkegaard's criticism of Christianity. So he has a criticism of Christianity, which is similar, in some regards. And then I'm going to get back to, I'll do some background on Kierkegaard in a minute. But anyway, he is a great writer of parables. And as a matter of fact, you can buy a book called The Parables of Nietzsche, I think. I have it someplace that is a fabulous book because the parables are actually scattered throughout all of his other works. They're not something that he collected in one place, but somebody has done this, collected in one place. And I have three of the my favorite parables, and one of them pertains to his criticisms of Christianity. And that one is this one. He tells of a banquet where guests are all gathered and they're loudly praising the food and just what and the decorations and all the flavor and quality of the food and how well it's prepared and everything, but nobody actually eats any of it. And this is so what Kierkegaard says is going on with Christianity, that everybody praises it, everybody talks about it, but people don't live it. And the parables of the Bible, like Jesus washing the feet of the disciples, is a good example of somebody actually doing something Christian. But that isn't what Kierkegaard believes is common in the Christian church. Rather, we go to church, we sing hymns, we listen to the talk, and then we go home and are dishonest in business and in our family dealings. That's what he thinks human behavior is like. Because we make ourselves feel really good by repeating the words, but we don't actually walk the walk. This is a Kierkegaardian criticism. So that's the parable of the banquet, which is one of his famous ones. Now, let me give you a little background on Kierkegaard. Nietzsche was raised in a very strict religious family. His father was a minister, a pastor, and Kierkegaard was raised in another strict religious family, kind of dour, and uh, but his father wasn't a minister. He was just this really intense follower, and when he was a young man, I think I told this story wrong last time. I was telling two stories at the same time. He's the guy who cursed God. Kierkegaard's father went up on a mountain and cursed God as a young man, and that was not Nietzsche's father; it was Kierkegaard's father, and it was sort of a family, a tale of an ominous tale that was told in the family. And as a matter of fact, there were five children in the Kierkegaard family. Excuse me, seven children, five of whom died, and Kierkegaard was one of the survivors, obviously. So they kind of looked at themselves like they were cursed. That family was cursed, and Kierkegaard. So this was a profound, uh, had a profound effect on the young Kierkegaard, who's a very precocious and bright individual, really smart. He wrote in Danish, which so that took a while to get uh, translated so he would enter the international conversation about existentialism. So it was a little slower perhaps than Nietzsche. Both of these guys had had detriments. The Nietzsche I mentioned last time was because of his association with the Third Reich. Well, his not his personal, but his thoughts were associated with the Third Reich. So that kind of slowed his adoption by the rest of the intellectual world. And Kierkegaard's was he wrote in Danish like an idiot instead of writing in some civilized language like English or German. And so that took a while for people to get most intellectuals in the world to get familiar with it. But anyway, as a young man, he started writing, and then he had this. He was a weirdo though. He was kind of a he's always called as a he called a melancholy dame, which is fair. And he only lived to 42, Kierkegaard. Now I've said before, there's guys I don't try to have personal feelings about all these guys. I didn't like Augustine. I was plain about that. And Kierkegaard is somebody I do like for some reason. I'm not sure. I've read just about everything by Kierkegaard, and there's something about him I have a lot of affection for. One is that he has a good bullshit detector, I think. He's very he will call a spade. And with regard to Christianity, which was not an easy thing to do socially, because that was the dominant, just like it was with Nietzsche, was the dominant school of the day. But anyway, so as a young guy, he what he would do, it's very weird. He would go out on the town a lot, and he had a particular way of dressing. He wore a top hat, and it was always very neat. It's kind of skinny and kind of old-fashioned, even in his day. And he liked to go to the theater, and he would write in coffee shops, and so he was seen about town enough. So this is Copenhagen, and he was seen around town enough so that he was kind of a character that people knew about. But then what he did was he wrote under pseudonyms. And I was going to ask our more literary people here, do we know of any other author? Okay, here's what he did. I have actually a list of them here. I've gotten together. Here, his perhaps his first and most famous work is Either Or. That was written by Victor Eremita. Then he wrote Fear and Trembling. That was written by Johannes de Silentio. These are his pen names. Repetition was written by Constantine Constantius. Philosophical Fragments was written by Johannes Climacus. The Concept of Anxiety was written by Vigilius Hafniensis. The Prefaces was written by Nicholas Notabene. Stages Along Life's Way, written by Hilarious Bookbinder. Concluding Unscientific Postscript was written by Johannes Climacus. Um, the Present Age, he wrote under his own name, and Works of Love and Christian Discourses, he wrote under his own name. Then The Sickness Unto Death, I always think of these as like heavy metal song titles, was written by Anticlimacus. Uh, Self-Examination, he wrote himself and under his own name, and An Attack Upon Christendom was written under his own name. So do we know of any other author that did that? He has a whole body of work, and only a small portion of it, maybe 10%, is actually published under his own name. Did anybody else do this? Peter, you did
I
it?
don't think so.
I
I
don't
don't
think
think so.
I can't think of anybody that
He
did that.
did.
From a marketing standpoint, it's idiotic. I mean,
William Makepeace, yeah,
you're breaking up
but
there.
he was hiding rather than marketing.
Yeah, well, yeah,
Amen.
but
Yeah.
still, I mean, what is the publisher going to say? You have a book that's kind of successful, and then everything else you publish is some other name. Well, you want to establish your name as a writer, like Clancy. Clancy. Oh yeah, that's going to be a good book. But no, he has to. And so anyway, the reason
think
he
there were some
did this,
women authors that did that in the 19th century.
yeah, but they would just write under one name, didn't they?
Right.
Yeah.
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 They
William
didn't.
Makepeace
I mean, yeah.
Good.
Thackeray had 3 or 4 pseudonyms that he wrote under, but he didn't write Vanity Fair or his other more serious works under them. He was at one point Michelangelo Titmarsh, Charles James Yellowplush, George Savage Fitzbootle,
Well, there's
but
a
I
that's
think they were early pieces that he was not especially invested in.
And Agatha Christie wrote stuff not under her own name as well, because she wanted to have a body of work that was not limited to, Poirot. Uh, I I think she did that, but Kierkegaard has a different reason for it, and he did this self-consciously. Kierkegaard was fond of Plato, very fond of Socrates, and I think he visualized. Okay, remember the thing about how much philosophical problems now, starting with Hegel, you can't stand aloof. You want to live through the philosophical problems. So we believe what Kierkegaard was doing. Well, I don't think it's just what we believe. I think he was self-consciously presenting his works as the the works of somebody who lived that life. In other words, these weren't academic things. Okay, here's one way we could approach this problem. Here's another way. They wanted to be representations of a person's life and his complete investment in this way of thinking. And so he created different characters, much as Plato would do in his dialogues. The characters in Plato's dialogues are supposed to represent, or they do represent, like and the lackeys, they are generals and they are talking to you as generals. And Socrates is talking to you in the dialogue as somebody who's not a general. I mean, that's the way. And so Kierkegaard does this on a book level as opposed to in a play or a dialogue like Plato did. So he was trying to present these people as not just writing about a way of life, but somebody representing a way of life. Yeah, Peter.
I thought of a closer parallel. I haven't read him, but the Portuguese author Fernando Pessoa not only had a number of pseudonyms, but they were supposedly imaginary characters who were all different from each other, and so there's this whole kind of fictional gallery of authors under whose names he writes. But as I said, I know very little about him,
Yeah, I had never heard that
and he
name
doesn't
before.
sound like a great writer to me either, I would say. Kierkegaard is.
There's the Alexandria Quartet too, that but that's fiction, you know. These aren't works of fiction, really. They're Kierkegaard is a great writer. He really is one of my. He's a great dialectician, and that is the right word for it. But he's great at pulling out the contradictions and forcefully revealing something by showing the contradictions that are embedded in it. So anyway, he was around the age of 26 or 27. He started this affair with a girl named Regina Olsen, who was 18, 17, 18, 19 in that age group. And they had this intense affair and became engaged. And then Kierkegaard broke it off when he was about 27 years old. And most of everything he wrote was after. He had already written things, but most of what he wrote followed that breakup. And so from the age of 27 to 42, he wrote most of his, well, he didn't write anything after he was dead, as it turns out. So during that 15 years, he wrote quite a tremendous amount of stuff. And the most famous things are Either Or and Fear and Trembling, and also the journals. His journals are personal, and so they're obviously composed by him, and they're they're very wonderful too. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I want to let me see. Shall I tell you these others? There's another couple of parables. I think I'll mention those to you before I go into we're going to talk about Either Or and then also Fear and Trembling. That's mainly what we're going to concentrate on. So let's see. There's a couple of yeah. I think well, I'll go over these now. I mentioned the parables. This is another um, parable, and this is from Works of Love because this is a real essential kind of existentialist thing. And I'm quoting Kierkegaard here. The ship's captain, okay, we're talking about a ship at sea. The ship's captain, when approaching the harbor, must decide the precise moment to turn the ship. But the ship does not stand still while he deliberates. It moves continuously forward. If he turns too early or late, a disaster will result. The captain must therefore make his decision amid ongoing movement, guided by experience, courage, and resolve, trusting that the moment he chooses is the right one. So too with the individual who must make existential decisions. One cannot pause life to gain perfect clarity. One must act within the flow of existence, embracing the risk and responsibility involved. So this is, let's compare this to an earlier Christian writer who wrote about a ship, and that's Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica says, a captain whose chief concern is to keep his ship safe in the harbor will never sail. So that's almost an existential or Kierkegaard's is almost an existential mirroring or reflection on Aquinas here. And so Kierkegaard's saying you can't find a safe spot. Remember this whole idea of philosophical problems. You can't stand aloof. There's this idea with Aristotle and Plato that you're going to contemplate life. You're going to figure out what's the truth. And the existentialist, and Hegel isn't really an existentialist, but starting with him, the idea is no, in life, that doesn't happen. You can't wait until everything's clear for you. That's that's not a possibility. You have to decide every minute uh, how you're going to proceed, and that's why existence, as Sartre says, precedes essence. So that this is another one of Kierkegaard's parables about that idea, the ship's captain having to decide when to turn and knowing that a second too late or too early will, like Sully Sullenberger, just just any, 1 degree of difference with his plane hitting the water and everybody would have died kind of thing. And he didn't have time to figure out the whole problem in advance. I don't know if you saw that movie, but I really appreciated the fact that Sully there's a hearing about it and he says, "Look, this was real life. I had to make this decision uh, with uh, without sitting down and diagramming everything out for myself." And uh, it turned out he was right anyway, but this is the kind of thing Kierkegaard's talking about. Okay, another parable that I is one of my favorites from Kierkegaard is uh, of a pastor. Now, this is kind of on the same theme that we can't figure everything out. So this is from a book called Practice in Christianity. By the way, Kierkegaard's also a great writer of sermons. He's just so good. He's such a great writer. Anyway, you want to understand everything before you believe, but faith does not demand such perfection. If you'll remember, Augustine said, "You believe so that you can understand." And so Kierkegaard here says you want to understand everything before you believe, but faith doesn't demand such perfection. You must begin where you are with what you do understand. Oh, by the way, I didn't set this up. A young priest or a young pastor has been studying the Bible and found all kinds of inconsistencies and anachronisms and so forth. And if you want to read about that, the best book, I think I've mentioned it before, is Thomas Paine's Age of Reason. What a teardown of the Bible that is. It's so great. Anyway, uh, so this young pastor has discovered all these inconsistencies in the Bible. He goes to see an old wise pastor, and he says, "I don't know. My faith is shattered. I can't believe the Bible. It's just so full of nonsense." And so the old pastor, this is what the old pastor says to him: "You want to understand everything before you believe, but faith does not demand such perfection. You must begin where you are with what you do understand. Go and do those things that are clear to you. Live them earnestly and sincerely. This is the proper beginning of faith. When you have accomplished this, when you've taken the first steps, then return and speak with me again. Only through this process can true faith be born and matured. Trying to grasp all the difficulties at once leads to despair." So uh, the the thing is that the plain message, I think, of Christianity, which is love your brother as yourself, is infinitely difficult to do. So when the pastor tells him, "Go do the things you can understand," it's easy to understand intellectually, impossible to do. And so that's what the old pastor is saying to the young pastor: do the things you can understand, as if that were easy, and forget about the things you don't understand. This is kind of a wonderful parable, and it's also consistent with the idea of Kierkegaard and with uh, Goethe and Nietzsche, that there isn't any plan out there that you can arrive at and finally know that you've got the right thing going on. That doesn't exist. So you just have to go. Anyway, a couple of paragraphs from Kierkegaard. Now, the his the two great works we're going to talk about are uh, Either or and Fear and Trembling. Uh, Either or is a book of letters between two guys. One is called A, and he stands for the aesthetic man. And then the other guy is called Judge William or the judge, and he stands for the ethical man. Kierkegaard outlines, and this is kind of echoing Plato, three stages along life's way. And they're different from the three parts of the soul of Plato because they're existential, they're stages, they're processes you go through rather than being uh, parts of the soul. Nevertheless, I mean, I can see parallels between the appetitive, although there isn't, no, okay. There's three parts of the soul in Plato, the appetitive, the passionate, and the rational. In Kierkegaard, there's three stages along life's way, and they are the aesthetic, which is Hegel would call the immediate stage. I'll explain these a little more clearly. And the ethical, which is the inner, which is the, uh, I would call it in Hegel, you would call it the mediated stage where you're thinking about things and not just acting. And then the third stage for Kierkegaard is the religious stage. In Plato, there is no such thing as a religious stage where you throw out the rational, but Kierkegaard's going to have that stage. The phrase leap of faith, which is often attributed to Kierkegaard, is not something he actually said, just like thesis, antithesis, and synthesis are not things that Hegel actually said. Nevertheless, it's a very common interpretation of Kierkegaard to say a leap of faith is required. All right, so what we have is the three stages along life's way are going to be represented. The first stage, which is the aesthetic stage, represented by A in either or. The second stage, which is the ethical stage, is going to be represented by the judge. And the third stage, which is the religious stage, is going to be explained in the book Fear and Trembling, which is about the Abraham and Isaac story in the Bible. All right, so let's just start with the aesthetic stage. The aesthetic stage is what Hegel would call the immediate stage, where you're looking for a life of pleasure. And the life of pleasure is broadly defined by Kierkegaard. It's not just you like food and sex and drugs and so forth. It's you also like Shakespeare and opera, and you're very sophisticated. You've read all the finest stuff, but you're still seeking that kind of gratification you get from a fine novel or a fine play or uh, some kind of aesthetic, elevated aesthetic appreciation, not just a bodily pleasure. And this is what the aesthetic man is pursuing. And he knows fine wine, he knows fine dining. He, he's he's indulged in all the uh, wonderfulness of life, and doing so, what he's tried to do is avoid attachments and commitments. And the two major ones are the a marriage and having a vocation or a career. Because once you do those things, what happens is you make a choice, and then your whole life is dictated by that choice. You're trapped in that commitment to that profession or that marriage, and so you do want to avoid those. And there's a famous passage in Either Or called "The Diary of the Seducer." I had one woman just got so furious that having to read this, she was so appalled by it. But I wanted to say, but I didn't because I have some self-control that it's not like women don't do this too, pal. But anyway, the Diary of the Seducer is about how you consciously set about entrancing somebody else and get them to fall in love with you. But when they do, the game is over. You're going to move on to the next conquest. It's just a matter of ensorceling them in your own web. That's the whole game, and that's the Diary of the Seducer. Uh, I'm not doing it justice, but it's It's elaborate and sophisticated. It's not just, but like for instance, you show up someplace you know she's going to be, and you never talk to her or you pay any attention to her, but you make sure that you make an impression as the most dashing and intelligent person in her presence. But you don't pay her any attention. And then, but you've already, stalked her, and so you know where she's going to be, and you happen to just show up at that place again. And this time you notice her just a little bit. That's the kind of thing that the Diary of a Seducer is about. And so this is because he wants to avoid commitment, but he likes the adventure. He likes the adventure of love. And this is the intense part of love. Once you're settled down, it's all over, according to the aesthetic man. Uh, I must say the idea of not having a vocation. I'm not like again. Remember what I said about Schopenhauer. There was a time sorry to just indulge in personal reminiscences, but when I was in graduate school and I got uh, hired to go play music, and I retreated. I joined the music business again for a brief period, and I went back to graduate school. When I went back to graduate school, I thought, man, I know exactly how this plays out. That I know what a career of an academic is. I've been around academia long enough to know. And after being back in music for a while, I felt claustrophobic, knowing that was the going to be the structure of my life. I had this feeling that life was too much of a miracle to be confined to a structure. At least that's what it seems like in retrospect. I'm pretty sure that's the way I felt, but reconstructing it. And this is consistent with the aesthetic man. He doesn't want to be trapped in this profession, right? Uh, okay, but the judge has a very good and also very existential answer to this, and that is that you're not free unless your free choices commit you to something. Otherwise, what you're doing is you think you're free, but actually you're being passive and you're just responding to the things that appeal to you at any given moment. And so you're really being not you're not making a choice. You're avoiding making a choice by just going from the thing to thing to thing that appeals to you at the moment. That is not creating yourself. Creating yourself means making a commitment and saying, I'm going to do this, choosing to do it consciously, and then following through on it. That's what being free is. So what you're doing is insulting the idea of, he didn't use the word, but existentialism. You're insulting the word freedom by saying freedom is just being a will o' the wisp and doing whatever you want whenever you want. That's not being free. Being free is making a conscious and passionate choice to do something and then following through on it. And your ability to follow through on it is consistent with your level of passion. And so I like to compare this to, in the 20th century, there's a Protestant theologian called Karl Barth. And I he was quite familiar with Kierkegaard. And as any respectable theologian would have to be, after Kierkegaard, the theologians had to answer to this stuff. Anyway, so what Barth says, I think, very wonderful about marriage. He says, um, no, marriage is a vow. It is not a mood that you're in. When you get married to somebody, you take a vow, and that is a choice to commit yourself. It's not like I'm in a happy mood today, I think I'll get married. It's okay, I've made a decision and I'm going to stick with this decision till death us do part. And Bart says, he puts it very simply. He says, before you get married, love is a question. Whether I love this person is something you ask yourself. But when you finally decide it and get married, love is the answer to every other thing that happens that may have previously caused you to question your relationship. You know that there's an answer because you love that person. That's Karl Barth's a distinction between being married and not being married. And it's that commitment that the aesthetic man wants to avoid. He wants to avoid uh, the uh, the making the vow, but the judge says, no, whether you got married or not, you're no less free. When you're married, the only difference is that you choose to be with that person every moment of your life. You're always choosing. And as Sartre says later, he says, you're condemned to be free. Freedom isn't something you choose to do. You don't have any choice about being free. You're always free, whether you like to admit it or not. You always like to make excuses. Well, I couldn't do that because I had a job at the time, or I couldn't do that because of this or that responsibility. And uh, Sartre says, no, that's never the case. And in his case, he uses the example of the French underground. He was part of the French underground when France was occupied by the Nazis. And he said, we've never been freer than during the German occupation. That was his quote. And the reason is that it is very clear whether you choose freedom or not. And the alternative is death. And Sartre points out in a little starker terms than Kierkegaard that you always can choose not to do something, up to and including death. No, no, and people do this, by the way. People in battle choose, okay, well, I'm going to do that even though I know I'm going to die. So you have always the alternative of dying. So you can never use the excuse that, oh, I couldn't do that because, you know, I I was married. I couldn't cheat on my wife because I was married. Well, what the judge says is, of course you could cheat. You're choosing not to. You're choosing to stay in the relationship. It's a matter of choice. And that is the essence of being free as an existentialist is not actually being free to do anything you want, but knowing that you're making a choice every second of your life. You're never not being free. And that's what the judge is telling the aesthetic man, that you have an illusion about what freedom is, buried.
Going to say that makes me think of the fact that many people who have been in battle in wars look back on that time as their being fully actualized and their life being, very, I guess fully actualized is right. I mean, because they had no choice. They had made that big commitment, and now they were fully involved in it, and everything afterwards seemed like it was less fulfilling and less, complete.
Uh, Doug knows Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard de Chardin was, I think, an ambulance driver. I'm not sure, but he was in the First World War, and he said the same thing. That was our finest hour when he was at war. And this guy's like a, Catholic. He's not a saint, but he's a highly respected Catholic theologian, and that's what he said too, Barry. Along with that, I just learned within the last week. I just learned this about the Second World War. You know, on Iwo Jima, the U.S. military had to use flamethrowers because they couldn't. The Japanese were. I don't want to describe the whole thing. Japanese were so dug in to the island of Iwo Jima that they prepared to do for a year or two that you just couldn't get them out. And the only weapon that was effective was a flamethrower. The problem was that if you were carrying the flamethrower, you had something like 70 pounds of fuel on your back, and you couldn't move very fast, and you were real obvious because you had those tanks. And so the Japanese knew that you were the worst terror that the U.S. could throw at them. And as a result, you were a target. And as soon as you shot, you could only shoot for less than 10 seconds. And then everybody knew where you were, and they'd try to kill you anyway. As a result, if you were operating a flamethrower in World War II on Iwo Jima, the death rate was higher than 90%. So if you were assigned to be a flamethrower, you were going to die. And everybody that did that knew that. And that's kind of an astonishing thing to realize that people were willing to throw themselves in that situation. So yeah, people do choose to do something that they know will risk their death. And so that all Sartre is doing is pointing out something that we all know, we just ignore because we just go have coffee and live a nice life. We don't have to think about these things. But uh, the existentialists want to point out to you that no, you're not just having coffee. You're making an internal choice, which and that is a phrase I believe Kierkegaard used. Every choice is an eternal one, and that's a different way of interpreting Jesus's the kingdom of God is at hand. In that you're not it's not life is not something that's going to happen later, or heaven is not really something. It's that if you're there are existential theologians, and they would say heaven is not something that's going to happen later. In fact, even Hindu uh, uh, commentators talk about karma. Karma isn't something that happens later. It happens right now. As soon as you make that choice, you've chosen to be whatever, a dishonest person. If you do something that's dishonest, it's not like you're going to get punished later. You're being punished at the instant you choose to do something that is wrong. You're being punished. That's another interpretation of the Hindu idea of karma. Anyway, I don't think I'll go into fear and trembling today. We'll do that next time. Fear and Trembling is based on the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Old Testament in Genesis. So maybe we'll save that for next time. Any any discussion, Jeff?
You talked about three stages of life: aesthetic, ethical, and religious. What about religious?
That's going to be Fear and Trembling.
Aha.
That'll be represented by Fear and Trembling. The first two stages are in either or, they're the aesthetic and the ethical.
The religious kind of includes the first two, but transforms them into something else. That's the idea, anyway.
The right, these stages, he calls them stages, but in fact, they can all exist simultaneously. And I mean, for instance, if you're in the religious stage, you still might enjoy a good steak, you know. Still might go to the theater or something like that. But so that it isn't like you get done with that stage and you advance to the next stage like a video game or something. That's not how it works. Yep, Barry.
I think, one of the things that always appealed to me about existentialism was this notion that you to live fully is to really realize your mortality, that your life is going to end at some point, which again accounts for this thing about that we talked about of people who've been in war. They know that death is very possible and even probable, and so their experience of life is completely focused and distilled. And it reminds me of that saying of, the secret of life is to live every day as if it were your last, and one of these days you'll be right. And it's because, when people say, what would you do if this was your last day on earth? Well, those are the things that you should be doing every day or thinking about every day, that always appealed to me about the existentialists.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, if you want to, because the Bible is so massive, you can find the kingdom of God is at hand will do. Put your affairs in order. The There are passages in the Bible that say the same thing, and you want to say, well, hey, Christianity isn't anything like existentialism, but there is an interpretation of Christianity, which is the primary advocate of which is Kierkegaard, that is very existentialist. He's well, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are thought of as the fathers of existentialism. And then we have, Camus and Heidegger and Sartre and others who also trod that path. But those guys, I'm not sure were surpassed by any of the things that followed them. Anything else? Anybody else? I see that my sailing buddies from yesterday did not manifest themselves today. Whereas this old man got up and did some philosophy talking, but Feller and Juiced and Deborah and Alice were too done in by the activities yesterday to make it to class today.
I'm sorry to be, apologies for being late, but I was on an Alzheimer's call that was supposed to be very short, but last week was the International Alzheimer's meetings and people were reporting on interesting findings and then some data cleaning and I don't know, all kind of stuff. So it wound up being much longer call than I thought it was going to be. So anyway,
Well,
so I will have to watch the summary or read it or something and catch up before Thursday.
Yeah.
But I'm happy, Dave, because my student's dissertation, my last doctoral student's dissertation, got signed off on by the other readers. So she's ready to do an oral defense next week and yay, finish.
well, when you say last, you mean your very last? Like there's not going to be another one?
I don't think so. I haven't started another doctoral student. So it's unlikely I would start one at this point on a dissertation. So at least the last current one.
It's weird, isn't it weird to reach a stage of life when you realize that this may be the last thing you do, things you've been doing your whole life? Like yesterday, when I took those guys out sailing, I may never do that again. That's
Well,
kind of a weird thing to contemplate.
well, I still am on committees occasionally, you know, so it's just I'm not going to and our grandson showed up with his younger sister the other night and I finally got him to talk about the paper he's writing and it turns out to be in my research sweet spot, which he sort of knew but not really. So I was very excited and I was actually able to point him to a couple of places he might look for some ideas on the bound he's trying to find or understand. He's working on something that's kind of combinatorics, graph theory, something that's kind of one of my fields. So that was fun to actually. So you know, he's still an undergraduate, but he wants to go to graduate school.
Hey, weren't you, Laurel? Weren't you when you first started kind of an outlier, being a woman in a STEM field?
Yeah, I mean, it was years before I was in a department with another woman. I was in one, but then she didn't get tenure and left. That was brief. But it wasn't really until I was at Harvard that I had major female colleagues around. I knew some at Stanford, but you know, no, I was kind of an outlier. And yeah, even in high school, there weren't a lot of girls, young women doing math. And being a young blonde woman who beat out the guys in math contests sort of was entertaining.
What? What?
There was something about, you know, just sort of challenging people's expectations.
Yeah, I get that.
You know, being younger than a lot of other people and kind of a.
Well, I don't want to make this all about you, but why do you think you were brave enough to not just fight the stereotypes in that way, but in your own mind? I mean, you were raised like other typical American girls, I expect. And
Well, you know, my father was a premature feminist. He had women students. He encouraged my dad to go to college. Their deal was that when he finished his doctorate and started teaching, then she could go to school. So he was a premature feminist and really was very supportive. And I had a certain amount of oppositional tendencies. So when, you know, I would get told, oh, well, you can't do that because you're a girl. I'm like, yeah, right. You know, just watch me. And if you do that and succeed, and fairly early on, I figured out that I guess my 8th grade algebra teacher, I had missed some school because I had an injury to my good eye. And so I wound up getting a C because I wasn't able to do anything, to use my eye or do anything for like a month or two. So I got a C the first quarter and it really pissed me off. And he said, well, all right, you can, you know, I'll put some extra credit on tests. And if you, you know, harder problems. And I realized at that point that he would draw his problems from the book, the ones that were not assigned because they were harder. So I went back to the beginning of the book and worked through and did every problem.
Oh God.
And after a while I had like 130% average, and he's like, okay, you made your point, you can quit. And I'm like, oh no, why?
Yeah.
And I realized at that point that if you work at it, you can do all sorts of things. And I really just didn't like being told,
Yeah.
oh well, too bad, you're a girl, blah blah.
I want, we mentioned early in this session about how women were excluded, as they were from most professions, from philosophy. And so I always apologize. We're not going to read any women because the major people are not women. Well, anyway, here's a corollary to that I found peculiar, and that's why I'm asking you this, is that I had many bright women students, but when I told them they were bright, I'm exaggerating just slightly. It was like I told them they had a good personality. In other, in other words, they really didn't take it as a compliment. I said, look, you have a talent for this. You have a talent for seeing these arguments. And they go, yeah, as if I'd said, well, you'll never get a date, but you're really smart. As if I had said, I mean, I didn't know how to, I did my best to try to phrase it in as praiseworthy tones as I possibly could. And they just didn't respond.
No,
But
it's Tony.
you
It,
must have, I'm sorry, go ahead.
it is in our upbringing. Um, First of all, we're taught that we should be very, very modest. We weren't raised to be like Trump and say I'm the smartest person ever, in spite of the fact that he's one of the dumbest ever. But also, it really is true that being a bright woman and having it acknowledged is viewed as, in a lot of circles at least, as inappropriate. One of my classmates at Stanford.
Inappropriate.
No, let me tell you, one of my classmates at Stanford, who was this woman who modeled part-time. I mean, she was this gorgeous, elegant creature, beautiful, was told and she was tall. She was like, maybe 5'9" or so, 5'10". And her doctor told her mother, when she was in high school, that she should discourage the Nancy from studying math because it would be too great a handicap in the marriage market for her to be both tall and good at math.
Okay.
Ah,
Were you told that?
No, I wasn't told that, but my friend Nancy, who I mean,
Were you discouraged from pursuing math?
oh sure, here and there, but math has the advantage of being pretty objective, and if you turn in a paper and everything's right, they can't really tell you're not good at it. It isn't until research time, much later on, that people can be somewhat disrespectful, and I did run into some of that much later on. But even there, at some point, you do something really elegant, and there has to be some acknowledgement that it's good. But yeah, no, that you can keep getting A's in it and keep getting hundreds on tests, and eventually, sooner or later, they have to say, well, okay, you're just weird. So you may be, they can't say you're dumb, but they can say you're weird. Like, okay, that's fine. Oh,
That's fine. I can live with that.
well, there are philosophy. I think there was, and she's focus of a lot of controversy. I don't think it's mainly because she was a woman, but I think that had something to do with it.
We missed the first part of that, Peter.
I don't know if I'm audible.
It broke up.
Just said, now there are women philosophers in numbers, and I think one great 20th century philosopher who was a woman was Hannah Arendt.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think that's one of the reasons, though not the main reason, why she became so controversial.
No, she was a Jew who was a girlfriend of Martin Heidegger, who was an unrepentant Nazi. kind of an interesting,
Yeah.
just biographical detail. No,
Well, I actually met her one time and somebody asked her
really,
about Heidegger. And she said Heidegger was not a man of the world. He didn't understand the world. Karl Jaspers did. Now, that's obviously not a complete answer, but I think it's a very interesting thing to say about Heidegger, that he didn't really understand what he was going in for as a Nazi. That may not be true. It may be too
well, he
kind.
never, as far as I know, he never repented. And I think by the time he was an old man, he should have known what they were up to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But he did stop wearing a Nazi uniform to class
Jesus.
in the 30s.
Oh,
For a while, he did.
we're not going to talk about Heidegger here, but I mean, he's worth reading. It's not, I don't, I just don't do that. I don't take somebody's I always use the example of Caravaggio. I still like his painting. It's not hard for me to distinguish the two, the work and the life. Otherwise, I'd have to toss Chuck Berry out, and I wouldn't like that. Or just about everybody. I mean, in the rock and roll
Yeah,
business.
just about everybody.
All right. Well, it'll be a little short one today. Like I say, I'm a little tired, and we'll just finish Kierkegaard next time and then move on. Maybe we'll start doing a little bit about the 20th century, maybe a little bit. And uh but we're winding down now. We're getting to the end of it. I might have a overall view to give you. I don't usually do that, but maybe I'll do that this time. So there you go. We'll make it a short one, but we will see you
I know
Thursday.
what we're gonna do. I don't know what we're gonna do when we're all done with this.
Yeah. Drink.
Oh,
Maybe we'll get a literature class or something.
yeah.
We've got some people here who could teach all sorts of other things.
Maybe calculus.
Oh, now you've gone too
No,
far.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Math and I started
Sort of philosophical.
long ago.
Yeah.
All right, guys. We will see you on Thursday.
Thank you, Tony.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.